So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was we've had two change of governments in Israel and America, which is perceived by many to be Israel's most important strategic ally. Um, what has changed on the ground in terms of these two new governmental changes? I mean, I personally was struggling to get my head around how you have this coalition of all these different groups and parties that I couldn't really see what's uniting people from the right to the left, Arab parties to whatever, to sort of right-wing nationalist. But I mean, I understand clearly their objective was just to get rid of Netanyahu, but what's changed on the ground in Israel, and also what do you think has changed in terms of the Biden administration and how that's going to, change the interface and dialogue between America and Israel?
So, in terms of the Americans, let's start there. We haven't really seen that much of a shift, I think you could say, in the American administration. Obviously, I mean, Trump was seen as a very, very pro Israel president in terms of policy. And we did definitely see a shift in that. Specifically, when we talk about Iran, the maximum pressure policy obviously is no longer in place. Iran has been brought back to the table to discuss re-upping the Iran deal. However, what we have seen from the Americans is them really sticking to their convictions of we are not going to return to this deal unless Iran also returns to full compliance, which we are not seeing Iran in any way agreeing to. So, I think many Israelis would be opposed to re-upping the Iran deal, especially in the form that it was in prior to this. And it doesn't look like we're getting there. But we'll see. That would be if we were to sign a new deal with Iran or re-up the old deal. That would definitely be a major policy shift from the Trump administration, no doubt about it. If we shift to the reaction of the Biden administration to the most recent operation in Gaza, what we see is consistency, I would say. We didn't have a major operation during the Trump administration, but I think we can all assume that the rhetoric would have been very, very supportive of Israel and Israel's right to defend itself. And that was the same rhetoric that we heard under the Obama administration and under the Bush administration. And so Biden's just followed suit. We heard very adamantly from Biden during the war, Israel has a right to defend itself. When his far left flank was trying to really push him to condemn Israel, he refused to do so. He continued to push support for Israel and support for Israel's right to defend itself. But of course, always asking of Israel to restrain itself and to ensure, minimum casualties, which I always kind of say, as much as they need to say it, they don't, because Israel always exercises that kind of restraint, and we don't need to be told to. That's just our MO. That's how we function. So in that respect, I think many people who were kind of wishy-washy or really questioning where the Biden administration was going to go on Israel, believing that, unfortunately, the very anti-Zionist right-wing flank or left-wing flank was going to have a major influence on him. And at least until now, we have not seen that happen. And so I think many people were surprised and pleased with the reaction that we received from the Biden administration during the most recent operation. So in that respect, I think it's holding steady. But we're only, 8 months in, so there's still a lot to see. But for right now, holding steady. I do think that the administration isn't going to be pushing anytime soon for a re-upping of negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, specifically due to the lack of a Palestinian government that has a mandate from the people. As we should know, the Palestinian Authority was supposed to have an election for presidency in May of this year and for their parliament in July of this year. Those elections were, and I'm going to do this, they were postponed, quote unquote, but postponement usually means that you provide a postponement date, a date to which they are postponed, and we have not received that date. And so postponement is nice. I would say they canceled the election, and there's no talk of when the election is going to happen. And so at this point, negotiating with a government that has no real mandate from the people is kind of pointless and would be somewhat of a waste of time. And so I don't think they're going to pursue that in the near future. I think their real focus right now is on COVID, the recovery efforts in America in terms of the economy, and again, Iran being a global threat. is a major issue. I should also, I would be remiss to mention what's just happened in the last few days in the Gulf, right? We had this Israeli managed ship that was attacked by a drone, killing 2 people on board who were not even Israeli. We have a solid coalition of the Americans, the Brits, the Romanians, because the 2 people who were killed on board were British. One of them was British and one of them was Romanian. So we have a real solid coalition of countries, the US, the UK, Romania, and Israel, who have really united around Iran is to blame for this and there needs to be consequences. So we are also seeing them stand by us in terms of that fight with Iran and not allowing Iran to get away with these types of unwarranted attacks against Israeli-owned ships or Israeli-managed ships in the Gulf. So that's the US administration right now. I should also say, to transition into ours, I think what has also improved is just the relationship, because unfortunately, Bibi Netanyahu had not that great of a relationship with Barack Obama, which of course bled into the relationship with Biden as he was his vice president, and they're very close. And so our new prime minister, here in Israel, Naftali Bennett, he has really warmed the relationship with Biden. And so that's positive in the sense that there is that really good, solid communication between the 2 administrations. Now let's shift to Israel. Really fascinating government that we were able to form. You said it, the impetus of this government was to defeat Bibi Netanyahu. There was a belief across the board from the leaders of these parties that Bibi Netanyahu was doing damage to this country and needed to be ousted from the premiership. And so they put their differences aside, and boy, were those differences great. Let's understand, we are talking about the right-wing Yamina party, which is pro-settlement, which is applying sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, and as far left as Meretz, right, which is a 2-state solution party that is against settlements, to then an Arab party that is an Islamist party. And so it is the most diverse coalition we've ever seen in Israel, which is really reflective of Israeli society and the diversity and pluralism within Israeli society. And so I think for many, people were very excited about the newness of this government and to see what it could accomplish. And I think a lot of people were also kind of sitting on their edge of their seats wondering, how long are they actually going to be able to stay together as a coalition? How long before this coalition?
Or what unites them? Like, what actually unites them?
So here's the thing, though. I think what unites them is a better future for the country. That if we have to put our differences aside for a year just to get us back on track, I'll give you a great example. During this 2 years of elections over and over again, we didn't have a budget passed in this country. We had a government that was based on a deal that essentially said a budget has to be passed by this time. And essentially that's what blew up the government. And so what we just saw happen with this government in the last week is they finally managed to pass a budget for the first time in nearly 3 years. And so again, when I say the better of the future of the country, just on the most basic level, right? How is the country supposed to function? How are governmental offices supposed to function if they don't have a budget, if they don't know what they're working with? And so just the basics of getting the country back on track, and also I would say unifying the country to a certain extent, the consistent protests against Bibi Netanyahu, the very loud voices who said we need change, I think really came together. And so we'll see, but we are seeing not just the budget passed, we're seeing laws being passed about taxes on farming, on the sale of plastic in Israel, things like that again, on the most basic level, is just things that governments need to be doing consistently to better the country and the environment. And so we are seeing positive steps. We haven't seen anything really dramatic happen since the swearing in of this coalition. But again, because of how much, you're right, they are so diverse in terms of their political beliefs, we all kind of sit with bated breath, hoping that they will continue to function. Even if, I think for some, even if you disagree with the government and you disagree with the policies of the different parties, just to have a government that can function for at least a year and get stuff done is really necessary right now in Israel after a 2-year lull of almost nothing getting done. And so progress, hopefully we continue to progress. Hopefully this really does bring people together. I mean, the beauty of this is we live in a world that is so polarized right now. We live in a world where you look at the American government and the idea that Republicans and Democrats are going to work together is just not even on the table, which is so incredibly sad because that's what it was all about, right? Reaching across the aisle and finding compromise and finding a middle ground, right? And that's the beauty of having two different parties or having people on the different spectrums of the political, having people on different sides of the political spectrum. And so I think for me, there's a lot of hope that I feel because at least what this means is you can have people from the right and from the left, and then people who have never been included, pretty much never been included in the coalition, like Arabs, who can come together and somehow work together. And that to me is really hopeful in a world that is, again, so incredibly polarized today.
So do you favor a multi-party system over a two-party one?
This is a much bigger question. I don't know. I think we need something in between. I think Americans would probably say another one or two parties would probably help, right? But that bigger parties that could actually have an impact, right? Unfortunately, the smaller parties in America have never really been able to gain much traction, not at least in the last 100 years. In Israel, I think many would argue we need just less parties, right? So in America, you have two predominant parties, and here in Israel, we have like 35 parties. So I think we just need to find a middle ground. Not too many, but also not too few.
So maybe there is some kind of political reform that might be needed to make that happen, but that's probably a bigger discussion for another time.